Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's lesson on how nervous systems are mediated by the brain. Before we begin, some of this presentation was made by a former student named Alex Martinez, so I need to give him credit. He's a senior now. And back then we had more time in class, so we learned nervous system responses by the brain through a project. So this PowerPoint was partially assembled by him. I made changes to it, but you must give him credit where credit is due. So on Friday, we discussed how the spinal cord allows for quick responses through a reflex arc. Today, in today's lesson, or in this video, we're going to talk about how the brain integrates messages through the nervous system. And one thing that's true about the brain is that the brain is much more complex than the spinal cord or the interneuron in the spinal cord, and it allows for much, much more complex decision-making. In a reflex arc, you can only take information from one sensory organ. In responses mediated by the brain, you can get information from multiple sensory organs, eyes, ears, nose, mouth, and then you can integrate that information to make one response. So the responses can be much, much more complicated. Okay? The trade-off here is that the response takes longer. It's not as immediate as the reflex arc, but then you also have more options in the option you can take. Remember, reflex arc responses it's one response and it's immediate. In the previous course, you had to memorize what the parts of the brain do. But if you take a look, parts of the brain are specialized for specific functions. You can look at some of the parts of the brain. You have the occipital lobe, which we're going to talk about today, which is due to vision. The temporal lobe deals with language. The motor cortex deals with movement. Olfactory bulbs here deal with sensing smell. We talked about the hypothalamus. Hippocampus has to deal with memory. But anyway, parts of the brain are specialized to do specialized functions. We do not need to memorize. You just need to memorize these. You just need to know in general how the brain integrates a response. And to do this, we're going to look at two examples. Okay, so we're going to take a look how vision, or how the eye cells, send messages to the brain. And again, this part of the presentation was assembled by Alex. So thanks for Alex. So it's the occipital lobe that receives messages from the eyes and allows for the body or the body to make responses based on what the eyes see. So we're going to look here how the eyes send messages to the brain to allow you to produce a response. Do you have to memorize this pathway? No. Okay, but you need to understand the general pathway that occurs. So here's Alex. Okay, and let's say an object is flying towards object. In this case, it's a soccer ball. So Alex's eyes see the soccer ball. And this is sort of simplified, but we can look at it. So in the eye senses light. So light hits the back plate of the eyeball, which is called the retina. Okay? And then the retina converts the light that it sees into an electrical signal, just like in nerve cells, via something called rods and cones that are in the back of your eye. You do not need to know the details of this. Okay? This is just in general. Now, these rods and cones send electrical signals through nerve cells, like action potentials here, and they travel through the optic nerve. Okay? Which will bring what the eye senses to the brain. Okay? Now, but this here in general is how the sensory organ receives a stimulus, and it's going to send it through the brain through the optic neuron. It's also important to remember that the optic neuron is sending the message through action potentials, sodium flowing into the axon, and then it's going to hit the brain and release a neurotransmitter to talk to the nerve cells of the brain. Okay, now we're going to talk about what happens once the message gets to the brain. Okay, so the electrical signal from the optic nerve travels to the lateral geniculate, which I can't say, Tommy, nucleus, and then the signal will travel to the occipital lobe. And again, it's in this brain, it's talking to many, 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 many neurons, okay? And every single time the message travels through a neuron, it has to go through a action potential, okay? The occipital lobe then processes the signal to make an image so that your brain can understand it. The occipital lobe then sends the signal that it got from the frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe is where all decision making happens. So here, this is where the brain is going to decide whether Alex should try to catch the ball, run out of the way. But the decision making is made in the frontal lobe. Okay? In this case, the frontal lobe is deciding to dodge the object, okay? And it's going to send a signal to the motor cortex of the brain, okay? Now, the motor cortex is the part of the brain that controls movement. So the motor cortex is going to send a signal down the spinal cord through the muscles, okay? Which will allow Alex to dodge the object, okay? Now, do you need to memorize this pathway? No. But these two slides that we went through show how the brain integrates a response. Remember, it got the message from the eye through the optic nerve, right? And then it traveled through different parts of the brain, okay, so that the brain could cause a response. This pathway, okay, is called integration, okay? And anytime that it's changing from different parts of the brain, multiple neurons are involved. And every single time you have multiple neurons, you need a action potential, and you need a release of neurotransmitter into the synapse. The second example we're going to discuss is smell, and how your brain is able to process things that your nose smells. So neurons in the nose have something called olfactory receptors in the sensory neurons in the nose, okay? And these receptors are specific for specific smell molecules, okay? So like, for example, in this picture, this is the olfactory receptor. And this could be, let's say, the smell of Five Guys, which seems to be always in my car, okay? And here, the particles of the smell, the particles of Five Guys that produce that smell, are binding to a receptor, which is, in this case, a neuron, okay? The binding, okay, of the odorant molecule activates a signal transduction pathway, which you can see here. We have the G protein, we have adenylyl cyclase, which then produces second messenger cyclic AMP, and then cyclic AMP binds to sodium channels, causing the sodium channels to open and the sodium to flow in, okay? As a result of the binding of this odorant molecule, okay, that starts an action potential in this neuron that's in the nose, okay? This neuron can then send the smell through other neurons to the brain, okay? And then obviously it is the job of the brain to evaluate this smell, right? And produce a response to it, okay? Now, here's the interesting though. The genome of mammals contains about 1,000 genes, okay, that code for these receptors that sense odors in the nerve cells of the nose. But we definitely can smell more than 1,000 different smells. I mean, if you think about it, we smell a lot of things every day, then there's definitely more than 1,000 of them. So how is that possible, okay, that we only have 1,000 or so different receptors that can bind to odorants, but we can sense almost an unlimited amount of smells? All right, well, the answer to this is quite complicated, and we're going to go through it a little bit. There was actually a question one year on the AP exam about this, which was pretty awful question. So it's thought, and this is thought to be the reason. Yes, it's Good Friday, and yes, I'm in school. It's thought that each of those 1,000 receptors that are in the neurons of the nerves of the nose that open sodium channels when the odorant binds, that each receptor is capable of binding to several different molecules, some better than others. Okay, it's also thought that each odorant, each odor or molecule that you're able to smell, is also able to bind to several different receptors, not just one. So this allows something known as combinatorial diversity. So for example, let's say you have odorant A, and odorant A is like the smell of coffee in the morning, okay? Odorant A has the ability to bind to neurons 3, 427, and 886, or at least the receptors on those neurons, okay? And each one of these is going to send, each neuron, when this binds to the receptor, is going to send a response to the brain. And the brain can then integrate the message from these 3 neurons and evaluate the smell. Okay. Now, maybe odorant B is, I don't know, cat poop. Okay. And odorant B may bind to the receptors on neurons 2, 427 and 743, right? That these neurons will send a message to the brain, and the combinatory action of these neurons will produce the smell in your brain. The fact that different neurons can bind to different smells produces an unlimited amount of ways that the brain can sense a smell. One thing I think it's also important for me to say here is that each neuron that is in the nose only has one receptor on it. So each neuron is only capable of binding to one odorant. So if we look at what it says down here, each of these smells which bind to different receptors on neurons, the brain would then interpret the different patterns of impulses sent from these nerve cells as separate odors. And this allows trillions and trillions of different smells to be able to be sensed by the nose and then the brain. We're going to look at two more examples of brain responses. One really quickly because we've talked a lot about it, and then we're going to talk about what the medulla does. So we've talked about the hypothalamus, so we're going to go through this quickly. The hypothalamus has the ability to send temperature decreases. Okay, if you remember from this, okay, when the hypothalamus senses a temperature decrease, it releases the hormone TRH, which then goes to the pituitary and releases TSH. And the TSH then travels to the thyroid, which causes the thyroid to release thyroxine. And then thyroxine can increase the metabolic rate, which produces heat and then warms up the body. Okay, we've talked about that one extensively. Now we're going to talk about the medulla. Okay, the medulla controls breathing. The medulla has the ability to sense increases in CO2 in the blood, okay, through decreases in pH. So the reason why when there's a lot of CO2 in the blood is like when you do respiration, you produce CO2, right? And in your blood is made of a lot of water. And CO2 reacts with water in your blood to produce carbonic acid. And carbonic acid is an acid, so it makes the pH of your blood go down, and the medulla can sense this. In response, the medulla in the brain sends messages using nerves, okay, to the diaphragm. Okay, and it's the job of the diaphragm to inflate your lungs to increase your breathing rate more quickly. When you increase your breathing rate, that sends CO2 out into the air through your lungs and brings oxygen into your body. So through sensing a change in pH, specifically a decrease in pH, the medulla can send a message to the diaphragm to increase your breathing rate. Our last slide is a summary of general brain responses and essentially what you need to know. You've seen this order before just when we were doing with reflex arcs. So let's go through it. So a sensory organ, whether it's the eyes, the nose, whatever, will sense the stimulus, which we went through some examples. And then that stimulus will go to the sensory nerve, okay, which will send an action potential and reach the brain. Okay, it is the job of the brain, okay, to receive all the signals from the sensory organs, okay, and it can receive many signals through many sensory nerves. You know, when you make a decision, you make your decision using your senses, what you see, what you hear, what you smell. And the brain has the ability to take all the information, okay, from all the sensory nerves, and the brain then can make a decision involving many different parts of the brain and many different neurons in the brain, okay. Once the brain makes a decision, whether it's, depending upon what it is, to like move or to whatever it is, it will send the message to an effector nerve, which will send the message, remember, through an action potential, okay, to the part of the body that needs to respond, okay. This is the general pathway of a brain response or any nervous system response. But here, remember, we're doing the brain, so because it's the brain, okay, the responses can be pretty complex. What is true about learning is that as you complete these pathways again and again, like as you make the same decision again and again, or you're learning a skill, these pathways become faster and almost become fixed. And that's what learning is. You know, when you have like muscle memory, or like when you're an athlete and you do a movement over and over again, the brain makes those connections faster and you get better at the skill. That's what learning is. Alright, so that is the end of the video. I will see you guys on Monday.